Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to this episode of the Wisdom of, and I want to welcome to the show today retired Major General Gus McLachlan, who I'll go through his bio in a minute. It's interesting, and it positions him to give us a pretty unique view on what we're really focused on in terms of the Wisdom of Show. You know, we live in an increasingly complex world with a lot of things going on politically, socially, economically, geographically, and it is a period of time where we need much deeper thinkers, wiser thinkers, and people really working through what's actually in play, what's actually going on, rather than the superficial tips, tricks, hacks, trends, what's popular, what's going to get us elected, what's going to make us the next bit of profit. And so, Gus, welcome to the conversation, and I'm delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Simon. You had me at wisdom. You know, part of our responsibility, I think, is for those of us who've got a few scars and have learned a few things, to have these conversations, and hopefully others might learn from a few of our mistakes.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing, and I want to go through your bio in a minute, and I want to actually check it on the screen, because there's some things I think people need to know about you, and I am so looking forward to this conversation. And the reason why I'm looking forward to the conversation is because of the backstory. Like we can't fake experience. And age, perhaps sometimes in today's world, isn't seen as all that popular, but, particularly in a social media driven world. But the fact is, you can't fake experience. And you spent 37 years in a career with the Australian Army, and in areas which are outside the range of a lot of people's kind of areas of focus: cyberspace, electronic warfare and command and control systems. You served as the head of Army Modernizing. What an interesting title, right? And I was not even aware that such a thing exists, but of course it must. And you're also, post-military, become a leading advisor on complex global strategic issues. And we are full as a world of complex global strategic issues. You're an officer of the Order of Australia, a recipient of the US Legion of Merit award for your services in the coalition forces in Afghanistan. You led Australian Land Forces there, some 35,000 Army personnel. And I'd really love people to think about that for a moment too. You can be leading a company of 35,000 employees, but there's a difference when you're leading, a military force of 35,000 people, where a part of the deal is let's go headfirst into danger. It's a really different kind of paradigm. And you've had some significant roles in the private sector across defence, cybersecurity, cyber and space technology. You're an adjunct professor at Monash University. So there's some really hard-earned experience in deep conversations around a lot of complex issues, and potentially the sorts of things that could either solve some of these issues or make them worse. And what I'm looking forward to, I've heard myself saying to people, it's possible that communication and contribution may actually be the key to peace. It's kind of, but we don't communicate. We don't think deep enough. We don't think about what's the greatest contribution we could make there, as opposed to a contamination or a negative impact. And across multiple arenas, you've had to live inside some of these pretty tough places and big decisions and difficult decisions. And so I'm really looking forward to unpacking some of that thinking around wisdom, the idea of stewardship, and some of the complex issues that might be in front of people today. So thank you again so much for joining me on the show. I often ask people straight out of the gate a question to get things going. I don't feel like that's necessary. You and I are having a chat beforehand, and you've already started to express some thoughts with people that I'd love to let you, I'd love you to set some of the context for yourself in terms of where you think the state of leadership is and the world and what we might need. I'd be really happy to let you lean in on that, and then we'll flow on from there.
Well, look, Simon, thank you. And thank you for this project, if you like. And one of the reasons I was keen to chat with you is I think one of the things we need to do is talk more. You know, you made the comment that you know, one of the ways to achieve peace is through more talk. Well, frankly, I've been to 2 wars now, and we've tried the other option, which is sort of killing your way to peace, and it doesn't work. The old, you know, what we have to do is create a dialogue and pass on our experience and learn that we're all actually relatively similar when we kind of peel back all those layers of difference. So I think this is a great project in getting people communicating. I also sort of reflecting on that, you know, that length of career when we're talking, it makes me feel tired. Now, we had a term in the military when we were engaging mentors like me that were engaging the greybeards, and I guess it's a gendered term because senior women don't have grey beards, but I do have one, and so I think it's a time in your career where you can reflect and hopefully pass on some lessons. I think our leaders in Australia and perhaps even globally have been a bit spoilt for a long period. We've had 40 years of relative global peace. We had unipolar US leadership for most of my career, probably started with the demise of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And while I did go to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the broad, the world was blessed with a period of, you know, frankly, some of the lowest violent deaths in our history. We saw improvements in access to clean water and education and food. So we've had a pretty good run. And what that meant was leaders probably didn't have to pay quite as much attention to this thing called leadership as you might have to when things get difficult. And I know you've been, and others have been speaking about leadership through the lens of our pandemic response. Well, all of a sudden, leaders have had to really step up into some challenging circumstances, and some have done very well and others not quite so well. So I think part of this process is let's share our observations. Yeah. And I did, you know, you mentioned I received the Legion of Merit. I received that from a fellow called Jim Mattis, who became famous for being, Donald Trump's national security, Secretary of the Department of Defense. But I knew Jim as an operational leader, and one of the things that he said to me that to all of us who stuck in my mind is, why do you need to make the mistakes when you can read about the mistakes of 1,000 others by actively reading and reviewing history and leadership? And you know, that's always struck me. And one other observation about leadership, my sister, who's a bit of my hero, is Professor of Medicine at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, leads the oncology department. And I've watched her approach to this thing called professionalism. She's never missed a publication on a cancer drug. She goes to every seminar, because at the end of that is a transaction with a person that she is desperate to try and, you know, achieve the best outcome for them. And that taught me about this notion of professional development, lifelong learning. And so, you know, hopefully we can have a chat today that will pass on some of that experience to others.
Yeah, it's a great opening. And, you know, there's a couple of thought bubbles that pop into my mind as soon as you, lead us into the conversation like that. And, you know, started with your sister. One of the things that I think we're missing, one of the things that I think the modern world has taken out of play, which is actually to our detriment, and yet it's critical, is pause. So we are so fast to respond, you know, email, someone sends you an email, I've got to shoot off an answer. And you might have just started a major argument with that answer, ill-considered, away it goes, in caps, all caps, and you know, away it goes. And, you know, I was listening to something the other day where they were talking about reintroducing pause as a conscious leadership behavior. And one of the examples was at one of the hospitals in the US, the surgery teams get together for a couple of moments of pause and silence and contemplation before the surgery to think about the patient. Now, you go and do the surgery really differently when you do that as a team that's going to undertake the surgery. And I have a model that I work through. I call it the futures model. If we're over here today, the future ahead of us is either a green line heading up to great, or a red line heading down to disaster. And a lot of people want to build a green line for wealth and a green line for success. And, let's leave wealth to the next generation. Let's leave success to the next generation. But we don't think about building a green line for wisdom. So if we leave a legacy of wealth and success to the next generation, are we leaving a legacy of wisdom for how they might use it? Because the next generation can destroy all of that advantage in less than a generation. And so we have to figure out how the heads of experienced people fit, provide some contribution to the next generations coming
Yeah.
through in a world that has no pause.
Yeah.
Instagram quick and everything else. It's a real challenge. And I think it's something that's confronting us. And so, when you think about complex global and strategic issues, and you're wanting to help business leaders, political leaders, and others really actually just stop for a second to just to listen to you, and you almost want to shock them into that. Well, hang on a minute. What's the message you would give people about, here's the world we've got right now? So just stop for a second on whatever the issues we're talking about, and let's just think this through at a deeper level. How do we slow people down just long enough to listen?
Yeah, look, some really important points in what you just made there. One of the things that I reminded myself, I was the chief of plans in the international coalition force in Afghanistan, and we had something like 80,000 coalition troops from a variety of nations, in the field, undertaking lethal combat every day. And they had a range of leaders between, them and me. They had immediate tactical leaders, and they had battalion commanders and brigade commanders and so on. And so I asked myself, what is it they need from me? And ultimately, it was what was between my ears. It was experience. It was reflection. It was the ability to stand back and pick up all the different trends and observations that were occurring that they couldn't see or perceive, and present to them that information in a way that was coherent, and of course with the resources that they needed to do their job. So they didn't need me jumping down their throat at the speed of digital technology, because I could see through a drone exactly what they were going through. They could do that themselves. What they needed was that senior leadership, which was about reflecting, thinking through the different contingencies that might be happening that they didn't have time to deal with. So I think one of the things senior leaders have to work out is where do we fit and what do we provide? And it is that reflection, that leadership, and the bringing together of our experience. In the military, we have a lovely term called the operational art. And it's that knowledge built on years and years of experience, training exercises and deployments, so that when something happens that's critically dangerous, that you can bring to bear that experience and help your people solve the problems. And I think that that sort of notion of what leaders do, I think, is really important. I reflect on during the pandemic, where some of our political masters felt they needed to present themselves every day to be yelled at by the media. And what we really needed them to be doing is absorbing the big picture, bringing in all the inputs about what was available in terms of medical treatments and vaccinations and health responses and so on. And so I think as leaders we shouldn't actually be bashful about the fact that we actually need to be the ones doing some thinking and reflecting, and then pass on that experience. And there's another term that I love that I was thinking of as you spoke. I call it confident humility. Yeah. So, when you get to these leadership positions, you have to reflect, you have to sort of believe that you've earned your right to be there through, all the experience and the things that you've undertaken, development programs and so on. But you also need to know that you don't know everything. And so being confident enough to ask for people's advice, accumulate that information, and then act on it, And I've worked for some great leaders. I worked for a fellow called Angus Houston, he's very prominent, senior Australian. He's done many things since leaving the military, in the hunt for MH370 and a whole range of things. And he was a great. He used to use people. He'd bring his experts into the room, sit them around. He had this big office with a whole bunch of chairs, and he would listen to them. And everybody knew who the boss was, but what he was doing was making sure that there weren't any perspectives that he had missed. And I think this is part of the confidence that you get when you reach a senior appointment, but you're humble enough to listen to others. So I do feel like this speed of things that are happening actually means senior leaders need to take time. And of course, what that means is having a little bit of time to listen to a podcast like this, perhaps read some emerging thinking around leadership, Whether it's when you're out exercising or on your exercise bike or whatever it is, because you need to pack your bags full of ideas because your people,
Yeah.
are going to want that input, next time they get access to you.
There's so many directions I could go in now based on what you've just shared with us. But there's that famous story about Henry Ford when a journalist said, well, how can you know so much? He said, I don't need to. I've got a series of buttons on the desk and I push a button and get any
Yeah,
expert I want into
yeah,
the room.
yeah.
It's interesting that you said confident humility. We interview a lot of people for the show, and humility is actually a common quality that comes up in great leadership. And leadership, to me, if I stretch leadership and into the realm of stewardship, great stewards calm people, they don't fragment them.
Mm.
And I would imagine in a conflict kind of situation, what you need your leadership to do is to calm everybody and give them a sense of confidence. Their courage is proportional to your confidence in so many ways. And I think what the opposite of confident humility is obviously going to be ego. And I just don't think people buy into ego as willingly as they do into a leader who says, I'm willing to make the decision. I'm willing to take that responsibility, but I'm not making the decision all about me. I'm making the decision about what we're trying to achieve, the outcome.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it. You mentioned at one time I had 35,000 amazing young Australians working for me, and I came up through the tank branch. You probably see my bits and pieces behind me in my office, and at different times I've been responsible for the helicopter aviation airworthiness system. I've had the emergence of cybersecurity capability, digital command and control, the advent of drone capabilities, and the simple reality is I am not an expert in any of those things, and so the ability to identify good people, know who is knowledgeable and who you can trust, and collect those people so that they feel like they've got a voice. And frankly, if something dangerous or difficult is happening, they feel confident that they can bring that issue to you. And then what they want is a leader who will listen and then make the decision that needs to be made at the end of the day. And so I think that's one of the things that we can feel comfortable that you can lead quite a disparate organisation without being an expert, but you can't lead it without good experts who can give you that sort of information. And, another point that just struck me as you were talking, one of the things that we did, we were quite early adopters of the kind of what we now know as work from home, right? So in the military, in Afghanistan, we had forces just distributed across the country, and we're in communications with them digitally. And of course, you can send them a equivalent of an email, or you can push out a graphic of where you want them to deploy their forces and where the threat forces might infiltrate across the border and into the country. And we do that a lot, and that speeds up decision making. You can push out information that they can consume quite quickly. But we've learned that you have to keep open a channel of information for talk, because it's in talk that you hear uncertainty, fear, frustration, and that sort of summary. Most good leaders in the military keep time at the end of a transmission period to say, right, let's talk now. How are you going? What do you need from me? What are your projections for tomorrow? And what I used to try and add to that was, again, it's that passing on the kind of rolled up view. I used to pass on, here's what I think is happening. And we might even argue about different things. In Afghanistan, we were very seasonal. Are these attacks the signal of the end of the winter period? The fighting season has started. Do we need to bring forward the allocation of some resources? And I think what that process does is it exposes you have to be a bit humble that you might be wrong, right? So when you forecast something, you might be wrong, but what the beauty of that is, if you are wrong, they know that they need to re-engage, right? If everything plays out as you describe, right, business as usual, let's get after it in any business. But if, hey, this is not what the general was projecting, we need to go back and let him know and see if he wants to adjust the resources and so on. So I think that dialogue piece, the voice, the fear, the uncertainty, giving people your projection of events, it exposes you because you might be wrong. But of course, once they trust you, that becomes a really important way to create that conversation.
Yeah, well, it's hard for people to trust an email. And I think you've just given a really interesting articulation for every business that is running a work from home or a partial work from home business model, which the world kind of is these days. You know, we hear people saying, oh, we need people in the office, you know, we need people to form relationships and everything else. But I think that succinct, you need a talk track, you need a talk channel, because you see how people are feeling, you can hear it in their voice and everything else. It's a whole lot easier to give a major general feedback that decision you made isn't really working out. If you've actually had a chat before under other circumstances, than it is if all you've received from them is a kind of an order issued via digital communication or something.
Yeah, and you know, part of that is you've also got to get your skates on. You know, again, in a big distributed organization, every leader can convince themselves that every minute of their day is critical, and they can spend it in an office, and they can be reading reports, and you know, all of us can do that. But carving out some time to go and actually walk the ground alongside that leader, you know, that subordinate leader who's got a challenging area, you know, and you know, they grab you and they pull you somewhere quiet, and they say, look, I didn't want to, you know, make a big thing about this when we spoke on the digital video conference, but I need you to know I'm feeling really vulnerable with this, and now that you can see it, I want you to understand. And so, you know, part of it is talk, but part of it is get out there and do site visits, or, you know, walk the ground, engage with individual leaders. And, you know, you learn who is probably, you know, who might have some more potential, who might be, you know, who might be finding their limits, and who might be really struggling and needs a bit of extra help.
Well, you also, you know, a big part of what we do as a business is help organizations visualize what is the genius of the company into a framework, a visual model, right? Now, the reason for that is that we take in so much more through the optic nerve than we do through the ears. And so when you walk the ground with somebody and they can actually show you what they're talking about, you know, the best mine managers, which is also a dangerous environment, walk the mine site every day, every single day. Now, does that get boring? I mean, they've been over that mine site so many times, but they still walk the mine site every day with their
critical. And while you're walking, you're modeling a whole range of other things, right?
Correct.
Did you wear all your PPE? You know, did you stay to the marked footpaths? You know, did you all of those things are what people sticks in their mind after you leave. The leader came down and modeled all the behaviors that he or she has been talking about. And, you know, again, it was the same, you know, for us in an operational environment. You know, did the leader turn up with the full, you know, combat ensemble? You know, did the leader look ready to deal with an incident if it came up? You know, did they know my circumstances? And so that credibility that you leaves a long trail after you've gone. So I agree with you, that visualization, and they're visualizing you for a long time afterwards.
Well, their license for behavior starts at the level the leader set. And so if the leader set the level too low, that's the license for behavior with the rest of the team. And you know, one of the best mine managers I ever spent time with would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and go around and ride on the trucks at nighttime, because a mine site's really different at night under lights than it is during the day, you know, and you know, the build up under the belt and all this sort of thing is impossible to see in the dark, but in the daytime it's really obvious. And then they'd be chewed out because they didn't clear it overnight, but no one actually saw it or could see it. Like, very different environment. It's interesting, as you were talking before, I have a conversation that I often have with people about the difference between intelligence, genius, and wisdom. I'm going to give you some definitions, or the way I think about it, and then I'd really love to dig in on your thoughts around particularly wisdom, because I think, you know, you said before, and I would love every corporate leader to hear that, to be sure that they hear that, the only thing that perhaps you bring to the table for your forces when you are the most senior person in the field is what's going on in here, and your ability to discern, let them know that there's this confident but humble leader really processing and making decisions. I think of intelligence as the unpacking and articulation and discernment of things that are going to change. So what's going on right now? And intel, right? What's going on? What's happening? And what do we think is likely to change? And what do we need to do about that? Think of it as an iceberg, and that's the tip of the iceberg. And then if we come below the waterline, there's this kind of genius which is this unpacking and discernment of contexts that are changing. So sure, there's a range of resources and equipment, moving around, and they've moved some into this area, but what's the context that we're in the middle of? A context is it's the start of the fighting season versus not, and there's some context that we need to be able to understand. And I started thinking about, well, what is wisdom then? And then I started to wonder if wisdom is the understanding and discernment of things that don't change. So here's something that doesn't change. If we don't plan to the very best of our ability with the best intel available to us at any point in time, we will lose more personnel than we should. That's a context that won't change. People are motivated by fear and desire. That's a context that won't change. So we can do all the cultural work in the world, but if people feel disproportionately unsafe with us as a leader, we won't get the output from them. If we can't disproportionately motivate them through desire and sense of purpose, then then the opposition, if you like, we might not get as much energy towards what we like. There's this wisdom is, here's some stuff that doesn't change. And I feel like leaders need to be able to operate at all of those levels. My concern is I don't feel like we can go down to wisdom. We don't pause. We don't just stop to what's really actually going on. I'd be interested in your thoughts about wisdom from the perspectives you come from.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue, and I used to reflect when I was promoted to general. I'd heard of these people called generals, all my career. I wondered what they did, and what I reflected was there's lots of people who are very, very capable below them who can solve let's call them the small and medium problems. The job of the general was to go and stand next to the biggest challenge and work out how to bring that experience and knowledge to fix it. And so remembering, what it is you bring, and then that's part of that is understanding your leadership evolves as you change levels. If you're down on a mine site running a crusher or running the vehicle fleet, that's your job to focus in that. But as you get more senior, you have to start to understand the other aspects of a business, including costs and contractors and safety and all those other things. So as you evolve, it grows. And what we've got to do as a leader as we grow, we've got to really work on that. We've got to grow our wisdom. We've got to grow our experience so that when we do get to those levels, we are able to, use language that I'm used to, sense the battlefield. That little noise over there, that village, that provincial leader who's, is really upset, the attacks on the fuel vehicles that are going down the main highway that may risk our, ability to give the population the fuel they need. The ability of, one of the nations might be, there might be political signals that they're thinking of pulling out back home, and if there's further casualties, it's that complexity and being able to listen to that sort of orchestra, pick out that odd note that is discordant, and then understand what it means to bring that into the leadership conversation. So I think wisdom is the accumulation of that art, that leadership art and experience that I know I know the business, I know the sector, I know the political language and landscape of that business, and then be able to as you said before, interpret that in a way that others can consume. And there's a great tool that I learned in as a military thing. We try and issue direction, again, particularly at that senior level. It's no good just telling people to jump 3 feet. It's the idea of describing something with a purpose. The purpose of this thing that we're doing is this. The end state I want to achieve is this.
Yeah. And
giving them the freedom to maneuver. Now, we might choose to describe method, so, purpose, method, and end state, but we only give method insofar as it might be to pass on our experience. And, to use a simple example from my old world, I need you to advance from here to here in order to, find a security position that will cover the infiltration route, down this particular prominent valley. And once you're there, you need to establish security for another organisation to move. And now I think it will be slow and difficult here, and you'll be able to move here and do this. And so you've passed on your experience, but you've given them a vision. And so if something changes, I always had the phrase, if you're sitting at a task and the task changes, what would my boss want me to do if she or he were here? And if they can answer that without, jumping on a radio or disrupting then you've kind of done your job. So the wisdom piece is all of that listening to that, that orchestra of noise that we're all experiencing, finding out the important parts of that, and being ready to do something. I'll give you a good example. I was not long left the military and arrived at Boral, big, great old Australian construction material company, 70 years old, founded by some veterans out of World War II. And I could start to hear the language of the government about this thing that we became the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah. And I went to the CEO and I said, this thing that they're talking about is going to come here, and it's going to be a pandemic, and we need to do some preparation. And they're good guys. And he said, look, we got some travel restrictions, Gus. We won't let people go to China. I think we'll be okay. And I said, no, I speak government. And you just have certain experience that you knew what they were trying to tell us without being ready. We had a great CIO who had he's an American guy who had some experience working in the US State Department. And between us, we said, you know what? There's a whole lot of things we can do to get ready before that. And that just comes from that ability to, in that case, speak government, understand the potential of what was coming, and then, mobilize a pretty good business to do something about it. So that's what senior leaders are expected to do.
And I love that idea of sense the battlefield and find the bit of the orchestra that is discordant. I particularly loved the observation about the role of the senior leader is to go and stand next to the biggest problem, which is actually not something we're seeing all the way through the corporate world and even the small to medium-sized business world. And in fact, in some instances, the leaders are avoiding the biggest problem that's in front of them. And, I think business is one of the most powerful forces for good on the planet if the right people are leading it. It can do things government can't. It is profit generating, so it's self-sustaining, and it can go across international borders in ways that governments can't, and it can do things charities can't, but it needs great leaders in front of it. And so I'm interested in, there's kind of three areas I want to go into now, just to also give some bigger context for people. I'd love to get a sense of, when you were involved in modernization of the army and that whole conversation about, leading change and innovation, which personally I think is table stakes in today's leadership. I don't think it's this discipline that should be special. If you're a leader, that's a big chunk of what you're doing, but people will get benefit from your experience. The second thing I want to do before we wrap up is see if you can give a snapshot of the state of the world for people, leaders, business leaders, of not a State of the Union address, but here's some things you should be thinking about or tuning into. And then I'd love to get some opinions around AI. You've been involved in technology spaces and military technology, and I'm sure you've been having conversations and been in conversations about AI. So they're the kind of the three things I'd love to dig into. So if we think about, when you're leading modernization of an army or of the Australian Army, what would you suggest to people as leaders? So they're not going to hire a change agent. They're not going to hire a change, like you have to lead this. What were your biggest lessons around that, out of that work?
Yeah, well, one of the things you talked about before was this notion of, multi-generational, long-standing businesses. Well, I was in a 120-year-old business that's going to survive long after me, and it had many, many wonderful characteristics, incredible culture, can-do, culture that goes back many years of solving problems. But militaries are also at risk of planning to win the last war. And the rate of change in the world that businesses are experiencing is exactly the same for the military. And I would argue, in fact, for the long time, military probably led, technical innovation in the world. I think we're now followers, consumers of commercial digitization and so on. So taking this wonderful organization that had many, many fine characteristics, including a lot of people who were really good at doing the things that we were doing, incredibly good, but saying to them that the world is changing, and we need to do something about that. And so the emergence of cyberspace, for example, intellectually we knew what was coming. We'd actually seen the Russians when they invaded the neighboring country in Georgia. This is before Ukraine. preceding all of their operations with cyber attacks that disrupted critical infrastructure and misinformation and so on. And so, it's one thing to know intellectually, it's another thing to be able to get this boulder, this giant boulder that's highly polished and really good, but to get it moving in the right direction. So I think that's again what senior leaders have got to do, and part of that is have to be able to describe the vision. I think you're a great storyteller, Simon, and I've always believed in the power of narrative. So part of this is to be able to describe a plausible future where these things that you are describing are clearly understood as important. And I remember saying to some infantry soldiers, when I was a general, infantry had been the purpose of armies for 2,000 years, to put a group of soldiers around other human beings who could shape their behavior, whether that's violently or in peacekeeping or whatever method. And I said to these soldiers, now that the future that I can foresee, and others like me, is that you will no longer be the purpose of an army. You'll be an enabling capability for a missile that can fire 2,000 kilometers. It will need protection, and the radar that's sensing it will need protection, and we'll need your help to get it there and get it ashore and to set it up. But after that, it's going to be able to fire 2,000 kilometers. And so this sort of transformation of what an organization might need to do. And again, the fact that the space domain and the cyber domain have emerged as new domains of warfare really over the last quarter of my professional career. So I think part of that is for me, for leaders, is to be able to articulate what these new domains and challenges mean. And a lot of people in business are challenged by cyberspace because they don't really understand and visualize it. But I think we have to, and we have to be able to explain why we have to apportion resources. And in my world, it's no good having the best digital command and control systems in the world that give you instantaneous drone footage and access to your troops if one cyber attack slices that conduit. You're all back to Stone Age chalk and carrier pigeons. So I think it's that sort of that's the first point I would make, is part of leading transformation is being able to visualize and articulate the plausible future that you're in.
Are you able to hold the second thought for a second? Because I want to dive into what you just said. I've worked on a lot of change management projects, and oftentimes the leaders that have engaged me, or the leaders I'm working with, are kind of using the change to figure it out as they go, which is almost the worst thing you could do to people. And you talk about, you've got to have a vision of where you think this is going to land. I think it is the responsibility of leaders to be bold enough to say, this is where we're headed. We've done a lot of thinking. We've mapped out what it's going to look like. Now we need you to come and help us make this happen. In corporate change, a lot of it is, well, we're going to figure this out as we go. And that doesn't calm people at all. No.
And one of the things you can, and of course, this is the period people are most, really most want that and expect that leadership. And one of the things we have done in the military is you can carve out a pilot unit, or you might have a transformation brigade, and that you can run your iterations of change through them. It's actually really exciting for them, and what we found is that the soldiers and leaders in those organizations absolutely relish that opportunity. Because in at the back of all their minds, as long as they believe that what you're doing is actually about making them safer. So if you're going to introduce drones and robots, well, that drone might be the first thing that flies over the threat area where you can't see what's behind that wall, and it turns out that's a Taliban ambush, or they've made one of these roadside bombs or improvised explosive devices, but the first thing that might move through it is a robot. That's pretty motivating when you're a soldier who used to have to do that job themselves. So Army's been pretty good at creating those pilots. What we haven't been good at is taking the best of those ideas and then spinning them out across the business without sort of distilling that. So I think the challenge is then to make sure that you can keep the coherence of that work and that passion and those lessons. And maybe, again, what I sort of advocate is get some of those champions who've experienced the benefit of not having to walk through that dangerous space and using a robot to do it, get them to go and tell everybody
That's
rather than the general standing up or dragging the kind of robot display around behind them. Have the soldiers tell their own story.
That's super interesting. Really, a lot of managers know how to distribute the changed system at scale. But what you've just said is that and I think it's a great observation, we're not great at distributing the experience at scale or the lessons at scale. And communication is often a forgotten part of this change, but it isn't even communication. It's actually having those soldiers who had the experience of it going out and sharing that experience. It's pretty interesting. What is you've lent in on a few things there that kind of point to that sort of topic of your view of the world at the moment, maybe through the lens of companies and leaders in the commercial world. There's a lot going on right now, and what should people be thinking about, looking at, trying to tune into? What are the bits of the orchestra they should be trying to notice? That sense of
look, it's a great question, Simon, and I know leaders are busy with a whole bunch of things that feel pretty urgent. It's the old crocodile closest to the canoe, right? You think you've got to deal with that, but at some point you've got to look up and look down the river, and there might be you might be heading for a waterfall. And so, I know there's ESG issues, and there's war for talent, and there's environmental compliance and board compliance and a whole range of things. Everyone can stay busy all the time, cost of living pressures and things. But I genuinely believe leaders do need to extract themselves and look further down the river, because there are some very significant changes happening in the world. And Deputy Prime Minister Miles released the National Defence Strategy recently in a press club conference. He talked in the most direct fashion I think I've heard an Australian leader talk about for quite a while, about the risk of sort of violent coercion of Australia's interests. We're not going to be attacked tomorrow, but the things that we have taken for granted, access to global supply chains, free movement across oceans, uninterrupted cyberspace to connect ourselves to those supply chains. All of those are now in play, and we've seen the oceans, the global commons. We've now got the Red Sea being disrupted, by exactly those long-range missiles I described earlier. We're probably going to see competition in the northern oceans as ice starts to retract in north of Europe, and we're going to see contests. So all that shipping that we've just been able to assume is a conveyor belt, we should no longer assume. So business leaders need to start thinking about what was just in time. We now need to maybe start thinking about some just in case provisions, and whether that's diversifying supply, whether that's having some reserves of capacity, which I know are inefficient. But at the start of this process is thinking about those things. We've seen trade weaponized by countries like China. So those 5 commodities that China chose to sanction Australia on, that's a bit of a foretaste of what they and others might do to try and manipulate behaviour. Again, so what of that comes back to senior leaders thinking about right now diversification and other opportunities. I think there's going to be a sort of a bifurcation of global systems. So again, we've had a pretty consistent single period of leadership, and that meant technical standards, 5G, internet systems, internet protocols. Though we've had one broad leadership framework, I think we're going to see that fragment. And the Huawei technology argument was really about that global leadership of technical systems. And I think we're going to see, fragmentation of global payment systems, global regulation. So, businesses might have to have multiple experts inside their business, particularly those with global exposure, who understand how to operate in those different environments. So it's really about, that impact of the potential change. And people, would say to you, well, we've always sort of tried to do this black swan analysis. Well, my argument, Simon, would be these are no longer black swan events. No. These are plausible futures now. Yeah. So it's time to get ready for them.
And probably not even the idea, the concept of the black swan is probably flawed
Mm.
in terms of the events, because the black swan is almost that unthinkable thing that could happen, and what if
Yeah.
it did? And I did hear you talking on an interview that you did, where you said, Australia does not have to be, a country like Australia doesn't actually have to be militarily attacked to be under threat, for all of the reasons you've actually just outlined. And so business leaders, we have a small company that deals in at least 30 different countries, and so we have international payment systems, and we rely heavily on the internet for international delivery, and we travel a lot and everything else. It's just not it's not just a corporate responsibility to do that thinking. It's anyone that is a beneficiary of globalization probably needs to be thinking about, what if some of those things that we've come comfortable with aren't there anymore, or aren't in the same form? So that kind of leads us into this third topic.
So just before you leave that, Simon, I think the issue of cybersecurity is the one that is already on our doorstep that amplifies that. So most of the malign cyber threats that businesses are facing have emerged from state-sponsored threat development centers, and they are in places like Russia, North Korea. Some are also emerging from China, and many of them are not directly state controlled, but the cyber attack capabilities have emerged from state level organizations. Those threats are here. So businesses that are not thinking about the implications of a cyber breach, really are not meeting their responsibilities. We know well, most people would know we're desperately reliant on space. A lot of our systems, computer systems, encryption on our computers, encryption on our payment systems, rely on the GPS satellite. GPS satellite can be quite easily disrupted. So these are things that are already here. And I did read a statistic, and I haven't validated it through any classified sources, but I believe we're something like the 6th most cyber attacked country on Earth. And we're not the 6th biggest economy. We're not the 6th biggest population. So we are clearly of interest to a number of malign players just in that one domain already.
And, none of this should be taken as fear-mongering for business leaders. It should be about heads in the game and prepare to the best of your ability, and really understand what's going on. We've been going for longer than a normal show. It'd be remiss of me not to get your it's impossible to do it in 2 minutes, but your 2-minute view on AI. What's your thinking around that? And then I'd love to finish off with 2 quick questions, just to know a bit more about Gus, if that's okay.
Yeah, look, AI is one of those things. I think it's a bit like the tide coming in. We can hold our breath and sort of hope it won't come in, but it will. So again, for leaders, for me, it is to do the best you can to understand the impact of AI on your business, on us as individuals, and we need to then demand of our regulators and our governments and others and corporates the best possible behaviour that we can. I think it's a tremendous opportunity. Again, in the military context, when I was the chief of plans in Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands of sort of what I call transactions a day occurring across that battle space. There is no way known that I could consume or sort or use that information. So AI will be incredibly important for leaders to have what we call decision superiority. If I can find the gems in that information that allow me to make a better, more timely, quicker, more accurate decision than my adversary, then I will win.
Yeah.
So that's the potential of AI in any business, and whether that's collecting data across the organization. There's so many pitfalls as well, though. Around we will start attacking other AI models. So can we pollute their data sets? Can we feed in misleading information? Can we skew the models and so on? So again, all of us have to understand. And I fear, my a bit more philosophical comment, my biggest fear for democracy is dis and misinformation. And already social media has provided a platform for dis and misinformation. AI will just accelerate that off the scale because, the amount that we've talked today is more than enough for an AI modeler to recreate us and have us say virtually anything that modeler would like. Yeah. And so we are going to, as a society, have to be much better at fighting for the truth. And democracies are not particularly good at that. Controlling information is that, that's almost counter to free speech. So they're the challenge, that probably the AI challenge that scares me the most, Simon, is what it will do to amplify this dis and misinformation.
And so once again, it's heads in the game, for leaders, really. You can't say, well, I'll wait and see how it unfolds. The gap will be too big in terms of the jump you'd have to make just to wrap your head around it, Two quick questions that are just a little bit about knowing you. Quick questions, quick responses. If you could be inside the mind of anyone in history and understand how they think about things, who would that be, and why would you choose that person?
Oh, gee, it's hard. I mean, I admire people like Churchill, and not, sort of, many traits, but his ability to mobilize, communicate to a population the challenge they face, and unify that action. And I think that's an incredibly important part of leadership. And, in the Australian context, we've had some, the Bob Hawks, or, this world, who've been able to articulate things in a way that populations have understood. So I would love to know, more about that. I think you can teach some of that. And of course, some of that is just genius. I had the privilege of meeting Barack Obama when he came out to Australia. I hosted him for one of these big rallies, they called it, when I was the brigade commander up in Darwin. And I admire him immensely for his positivity and energy and optimism. And, I'd love to sort of have a dinner party with him just to, when you spoke to him, you people say this a lot, but you felt like you were the only person in the room. We had the families of the boys who'd been killed from our brigade in this giant hall with 4,000 other people. And I had the chance to say to him, when you come off the stage, the first people you will meet will be the families of our fallen soldiers. I spoke to them afterwards, and they said, Gus, it was like the rest of the building disappeared. Wow. And he engaged with us in a way that was quite extraordinary. Yeah. And that's a superpower, right? I think there's a sort of underlying kind of empathy and something magical. I'd love to be able to get in his head. But so there are a couple of people that
absolutely. And so then attached to that, and then we'll wrap it up. You've sat in rooms where big decisions are having to be made, but I'd be interested in what room you would love to have been in, even if just as a fly on the wall, historically, where some kind of big decision was made. What's something that's kind of intrigued you, and you would love to have been there when they were thinking their way through this?
One of the situations I admire immensely, and I'm going to risk getting this wrong, but I think it was Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister, who in the middle of World War II jumped on a series of aeroplanes to go to London to tell Churchill, that towering, figure who probably, unified the Western Alliance, to say to him, I'm bringing Australian troops back to the Asia Pacific region because the bigger threat for us is Japan. And having the moral courage to go and do that in the middle of a war, and then start to bring Australian troops back because the war had pivoted for us. What an extraordinary, thing for an Australian leader to do. I mean, we were not the, middle power, assertive, prominent democracy we are now. So I just admire that kind of courage. And who knows what the outcome, what we've all celebrated as the battle for Kokoda and stopping the Japanese. They were all the troops that, that had come out of places like North Africa. So I absolutely admire Australians who, I've got another weird one, Simon. I often drive across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and I think Hatfield was the engineer and architect. The vision to make 6 lanes and a train line, when you're designing a bridge in 1910 or 1920, visualising something that was probably, what we now know as modern Sydney. Yeah. What an extraordinary, I just love that
and he had to fight for it.
Absolutely.
He really had to fight for it. They didn't think they needed the bridge that wide, or that big,
And you look down from the bridge, and of course you see Jan Utzon's incredible creation at a time when, men in Sydney were wearing Homburg hats and tweed jackets with leather patches on their arms, and he visualized this incredible, piece of art that will hopefully be there for another 100 years. So yeah, look, don't get me started. I admire and am envious of that sort of vision genius. I don't confess to having that kind of vision.
So, Gus, thank you so much for giving us this time. You've been incredibly generous. I want to thank everyone that's watched the episode all the way through to catch those pearls of wisdom. And, I hope you got some notes, because it was just chock full of those moments of pause that leaders who really want to lead in a meaningful way should be leaning in on. We need leadership more than we ever have. We need leadership that's wisdom driven more than we ever have. My challenge to everybody is, is to really test how you can become that steward of deep wisdom that actually puts you next to the biggest problem and has you take the leadership role in that, and then be able to bring people with you to actually solve the biggest problems that we're facing. So Gus, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your insights that can really only come from, over 40 years worth of experience in interesting environments. Thanks so much for giving us the time.
No, thanks for creating the conversation, Simon. It's been a great, and look, a captive audience where you can, tell stories. But I think this is part of wisdom, is having that chance to pass it on to others.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.